who will be presenting her honors project at Look Back today. Lily Payson was born in Ashland, Nebraska, the daughter of Adam and Amy Payson. She was homeschooled during her high school years and below, as her parents endeavored to give her a more classically trained educated curriculum, focusing on logic and philosophy, as well as arts and history. She is currently a senior at Wayne State College and is majoring in English writing and literature with minors in both philosophy and editing and publishing. Along with being part of the honors program, Lily has worked both as a resident assistant for Residence Life and as a tutor for the Holland Academic Success Center. She has both been published in and helped with the design of the 2024-2025 Judas Goat, a student literary magazine, and has emceed a past open mic for the book's release. She has helped judge and run past fiction and poetry slams and has read and placed in several of these slams before. Her goal is to go on to write books and get them published, with this project being only the first step towards that ambition. She will graduate in the spring of 2026 after completing her final year here at WSC.
Thank you. This project is over a fantasy anthology I wrote called Don't Look Back, where I explore 5 different subgenres of fantasy through each of these short stories. So the goal of the project was to go through, write, edit, design, print, self-publish, and develop. Fantasy is a genre that I have loved since I was little, and my dad read the Chronicles of Narnia to me and my siblings, as well as The Hobbit and the Living Room. It's also one of the more daunting genres to write, as there's a lot more world building needed when you are creating a fantasy story. It's not a genre I've spent a lot of time writing whenever I have written anything, so I wanted to challenge myself to get out of that comfort zone and try to create something new. So what even is this? It's a collection of short stories. Each of the subgenres, in order, are magical realism, flintlock fantasy, sword and sorcery, historical fantasy, and grimdark fantasy. As I stated, the goal was to go through all the steps of self-publishing. This here is an example of what the finished cover looks like. The first step, before I even delved into writing any of this, was to research what the fantasy genre is, what goes into it, and what its history was, so I could understand how to write it better. So, Britannica defines fantasy as imaginative fiction that relies on strangeness of setting, such as other worlds or times, and of characters, such as supernatural or unnatural beings. Its origins, from what I could gather, seem to lie in myth and in fairy tales, usually told through oral tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh is thought to be the first recorded fantasy tale, though there's no way of knowing if that's actually the first one that was written. It's likely not, but it's the first one that we can actually track. So there's a few necessary components that go into a fantasy genre. Because it is such a wide-spanning genre, I wanted to narrow down what it actually takes to create a fantasy story, what needs to be there. The first thing is world building. Even if it is set here in this world, we need to create a system of rules for your world. Fantasy relies heavily on magic and imagination, and as such, there needs to be some kind of trackable system that all of these characters are using throughout it. If you are not set in this world and it's set in another one, you need to build your fantasy world, you need to establish the rules of it, you need to establish what the dynamic of this world is. We obviously know how our own world works, but how is this one? Does the class system work the same? Are there still the same races? And then how are those races treated? Those are important things to establish to allow your reader to understand what they're stepping into. There also needs to be an incorporation of good versus evil. This does not have to be concrete. It's not always clear who is good and who is evil, but there should be a tension between these two forces that's at play. And finally, there should be a concrete goal, something the main character is attempting to accomplish, although I would say that's true of any genre across the board. So, I went through and created 4 main eras of fantasy as how I thought it was best divided. Say, there is ancient fantasy, which is most of the fantasy set before the 1700s. This is going to be like the Iliad and the Aeneid, Beowulf, the Mabinogi, Gilgamesh, all of those kinds of things. So this is largely myth and religion is going to be the crux of this. Then you move into old and primarily Gothic fantasy between the 17th and the 1900s, such as Dracula, Carmilla, Frankenstein, the vampire, Gothic literature tends to focus more on this idea of the other and a world that is not as familiar to us as this world. So it's a good setting for a fantasy story. Then we have modern fantasy. So this is going to be your Lord of the Rings, Narnia. This is, I would say, when fantasy really took off as people think about fantasy nowadays. And then we have contemporary fantasy, or my generation's fantasy, as well as a bit backwards. 1970s to current. So this is going to be like Court of Thorn and Roses, Game of Thrones, Percy Jackson, various different, like all of the works of Brandon Sanderson that are incredibly popular right now. That's going to be our contemporary fantasy. Some of the influential fantasy authors, though there are many, these are some of the main 3 that have helped define it. The first, considered father of fantasy genre is George MacDonald from 1924 to 1905. He wrote The Princess and the Goblin and The Phantastus, though that could be pronounced differently. His literature has been pointed to as the originator of the fantasy genre. There is C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Chronicles of Narnia, and helped establish this tradition of this incredible world building, that idea of another world that you can step into. I think, though he's not the only one writing that kind of genre, I think that really helped that take off. And then J.R.R. Tolkien, definitely considered father of fantasy, and has probably been one of the most influential modern authors when it comes to the building blocks of high fantasy, and he did The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. A few other notable ones: Edmund Spenser, Fairy Queen, Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, The Well, The World's End, The Wizard of Oz, very relevant right now. The Sword and the Stone, The Wizard of Earthsea, and a few others. But again, only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the fantasy authors that are out there. A few common misconceptions I wanted to clear up. Like I said, good and evil do not need to be clear. Fantasy does not always equal the Middle Ages. Many people said it there, it does not have to be there. Horror is not the same as fantasy. Horror is fantasy with the intent to terrify. So I would say horror sometimes ends up being a subgenre of fantasy, but they are not the same, and a lot of people mix them up. A lot of people believe that science doesn't have a place in fantasy. That's simply not true. It totally can. And honestly, some of the best fantasy does incorporate it. A lot of people feel like magic doesn't have rules. Well, it's sometimes true, a lot of times it does. A lot of times there's a clear system that's being followed. Otherwise, your system and world will feel unbalanced. Then elves, wizards, and dragons, oh my. Those do not have to be the only races that exist. You do not have to rely on the classic fantasy characters. Writing the book. So my process can essentially be broken down into writing and editing it. This is what I spent my $395 course on. And then in my $499 course, I worked on the cover and the interior design of the book. Working largely with Chad and Christensen in this process. And then the final step was to print it and self-publish it. So my chosen subgenres: magical realism, which is fantasy that takes place within a realistic setting, though it contains magical components. Flintlock fantasy, which is very specifically between the 15th to the 1800s. It focuses more on revolution, the mixing of magic and guns, specifically the flintlock gun. There are many other genres that explore just magic and guns in general. Sword and sorcery, because that's kind of your classic sword fighting heroes, with morally gray protagonists launching out on epic quests. Historical fantasy, anti-fantasy set in history, and finally grimdark fantasy, which focuses more on a gritty realism. So it's not realistic, focuses on realism. So characters acting the way that people do, even though they don't want to admit to it. The 5 stories I have is Harper, my first one, set in modern-day Maine, where Vivian sets out to meet the mother she never knew, who's happily working at a magical tattoo shop. The second one is Stowaways. It's set in the 80 Years' War, and it's about Felix, a young deserter from the war who's fled his country and ends up meeting a young girl who is not quite what she seems. A Lilac Grove, where Vera, a young princess, blocked in by the magical territory of the Lilac Grove that surrounds their kingdom, decides to set out and destroy the beast fighting their town. The Magician's Tomb, which is the story I will be reading a little bit of today. An effort to escape an unwanted union between Wales and England, Alice, an unhappy housewife, sets out to find Glendower to raise them and help them in their time of need. And then finally, the final hope of the fool, Darius, a longshoreman, is on a quest to track down his missing father and ends up in prison with one of the men whom his father placed there. So many people underestimate the time devoted towards the design of the book itself. This can take almost as long as writing the book itself, especially when you're doing it in a book. It especially can. So here's a few of the things to know about it. There's the inside material. You're going to create the front matter, so that's your title page, half title page, copyright, dedications, contents, introductions, anything right before the story begins, really, is front matter. You're going to want to create your chapter page. You want a consistent design going across all of your chapters, usually. You're going to need to format headers, page numbers, font, and sizing, all those fun technical details. And then back matter, acknowledgments, author bio, a blog, glossary, again, anything right after the book ends. There's a few different ways to create a cover. These are not all of them. Canva was my chosen method. There's also Adobe Express, going to a traditional publisher and having them track someone down for you. Commissioning an artist to design a cover for you, which is what, if I had more money, I would have done. This is my front and back cover here. I decided to go through Ingram Spark Publishing, which is a print-on-demand distributor and wholesaler. They can provide you with a free ISBN, which is one of the reasons why I chose them. And then they would be able to put my work up both as an ebook and as an actual physical book. So the ebook is up on Amazon and various different services right now. I decided to purchase physical copies of the book as well. I did not have to do this, but I wanted to go on with this process to try to sell these. So my work with this doesn't end here, but the project itself does. So what does it mean to actually self-publish your book? You need to write and edit it. You need to design a professional looking cover. You need to choose a distribution platform, which I have done. If you would like, you can set it up as an ebook, prepare it for global distribution, print your book if you would like to sell copies, and then primarily promoting and marketing, which is the thing that if you went through a traditional publisher, you may not have to worry about as much, which I believe is why so many people like going. It's not always the fun part of it for everyone. There were some technical errors, many technical errors. As this was my first time using Ingram Spark, there's going to be some mishaps. My book was finally sent off to be printed, but it will not be here in time for today. So, I have a printed off manuscript of the inside of it as, a physical proof that it's there. And it will be on its way somewhere over winter break. This is the ebook up on Amazon. This is kind of a look at what the inside looks. So you got that title page, copyright, contents, author bio, and acknowledgements. This is kind of what an inside spread looks like of an average page. You got chapter and then inside. And then I'm going to read a little excerpt from The Magician's Tomb. This is the story about the girl who's a housewife going out to track down Glendower. So I'm starting a little bit in the middle, but not too much, so it will not be. Ever since I was little, it had been said of me in so many words that my life was worthless. This belief started with my birth when I made the irrevocable mistake of being born a woman instead of the son my father yearned for. It was not an unusual burden to carry, and was one I shared with all the other women in our small but thriving village of Aberdew. Women were loved, of course, and cherished, considering they kept within the boundaries that had been well established for them. Their use was limited, however, to that of reproduction and housekeeping, a comfortable item to brighten men's days and warm their nights. It was no secret that a son was preferable. As to my parents, I was the final girl in a streak of 6, and as such, the disappointment was much larger than with my sisters. My father did the best to cope that he could. I think, somewhere in his mind, he believed that if he treated me as a son, raised me as he would a man, I might transform overnight into the diligent son he had longed for. Sometimes I found myself wishing the same. That said, I benefited greatly from his delusions, even if they were just those, delusions. I was taught to read, a privilege that had not been extended to my sisters. He insisted that I had all the classics at my disposal, at least to my family, or at least those we had access to, and I would often spend my nights reading by the firelight to my family. These were some of my favorite memories. I loved to see the wonder in my sister's eyes, and I secretly delighted that, despite being the youngest, I was the only one out of us that could unlock these worlds and bring them to life with my voice. Later, of course, the guilt of their exclusion became too much, and I tried to teach them the best I could in the hours after the housework was done. There was a silent understanding amongst us that neither father nor mother were to be told about these private lessons. I was given as extensive an education as I could be given with our limited funds, full of history, mathematics, and a beginner's grasp of rhetoric. My father knew only what his own had taught him, and so there were gaps in history that he could not fill out, equations that could not be solved, and books we could not afford. He minded this more than I did. It was more knowledge than most could boast of having in Aberdew, and I devoured everything I was given ravenously. Still, the more I excelled, the more his disappointment in me seemed to grow. I would sometimes catch his eye while doing my lines at the kitchen table, and notice him staring with a strange look on his face. Whenever I asked, he would just shake his head and murmur, "Just a shame is all. You would have made an excellent son." I was never quite sure what to say to that, so I usually nodded and turned back to my studies in silence. It is strange. Though I know he would not approve of my quest if he were alive, I have him to thank as my inspiration for it. Out of all the stories I had been taught in my childhood, the one that stuck out most was the rebellion of the Prince of Wales, Owain Glendower. I marveled at how he bucked against English rule and listened with rapt attention as he led rebellion after rebellion, providing hope for a people whose lives had not been in their own hands for centuries. My appreciation for him only grew as I aged and was able to understand the intricacies of his intelligence and skill in battle. The most believed he was merely a brilliant strategist. Some remembered him to be a magician who held command over the minds of his armies with but a single word. Though I would never say as much and embarrass myself to my family, I had always believed in the latter. The stories all ended the same way. After England had overtaken his castles, his armies, and his family, Glendower disappeared mysteriously one day, never to be seen again. This was where my mother would have had to explain that he had likely been given a quiet burial in order to save his body from mutilation after his treason. My father thought differently. He believed Glendower was merely sleeping, waiting for someone worthy to find his tomb and ask for his help in a time of need. Silly superstition, my mother called it. Hogwash, my sisters would chime in. My father and I were the only ones who knew differently. And today, I was to set out to find him.